This is Theodora Scarato. I'm Executive Director with Environmental Health Trust, and we're here to have a press conference about the brief that's been filed in the case Environmental Health Trust versus the FCC. We're challenging the FCC's refusal to update their 25-year-old obsolete wireless radiation, human exposure, safety limits, and regulations around compliance for cell phones, wireless devices, and cell towers. Lawyer Ed Myers is here representing Environmental Health Trust, and he's also representing petitioners, which include myself, Elizabeth Barris, and Consumers for Safe Cell Phones. Our brief is filed jointly with Children's Health Defense. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Myers. He's an attorney in Maryland. He's a graduate of the University of Notre Dame Law School and formerly was Assistant General Counsel to the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America and Senior Attorney to the U.S. Department of Energy. For over 30 years, Mr. Myers has practiced law before federal regulatory agencies. He supervised an interdisciplinary team in the establishment of a land trust to preserve part of the historic Teapot Dome in Wyoming for the benefit of Native American tribes. He also worked closely with NRDC to overturn the FCC's order exempting certain wireless facilities from review under NEPA and NHPA in a petition before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit Court. So if you'd like to explain some of what our brief was about, what we contend, and we will be taking questions, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will be answering them as well.
Okay. Thank you, Theodora. Good afternoon, everyone. We filed a brief yesterday on behalf of the petitioners, as Theodora indicated, challenging an order of the Federal Communications Commission. The decision of the FCC terminated an inquiry that was begun in 2013, looking at whether to revise and update regulations promulgated way long ago in 1996 to protect the public health and safety, supposedly, and to meet the FCC's obligations under the National Environmental Policy Act. The FCC received an enormous number of peer-reviewed scientific and medical studies, analyses, and reports in response to its 2013 notice of inquiry. These submissions demonstrated the consensus of the scientific community that radio frequency radiation, which comes from all of your cell phones, your Wi-Fi devices, just about anything telecommunications related today, is harmful. The radiation that comes from those devices is harmful to human health and safety, sometimes lethal to some individuals. And it is harmful as well to the environment. There's an enormous record in this case. Unfortunately, the Federal Communications Commission did nothing in response to the submissions it received beginning in 2013 until 2019, when it decided that the submissions were insufficient to convince it that it needed to revise and update the 1996 standards. To put it in perspective, the 1996 standards were promulgated at a time when cell phones were in the 2G stage, generally speaking. Most cell phones at that time just had one antenna inside of them transmitting radio frequency radiation. Today's cell phones mostly are 3G and 4G, and soon, actually already in some places, 5G enabled cell phones. And they will contain anywhere from 5 to 6 antenna inside of them, many times operating simultaneously, and each one of them generating radio frequency radiation. Unpersuaded by the evidence, the FCC decided to terminate its notice of inquiry without taking any action to update the 1996 standards. Our argument in the court is that the FCC failed to meet its statutory obligations. First, under the Communications Act, it has an obligation to protect public health and safety. Secondly, because the agency did not even look at most of the evidence. And what it did look at, it based on a conclusory letter from the Food and Drug Administration, but the FDA provided no analysis either. It was just a short couple of page letter containing a lot of conclusions and no facts. Based on that, we allege in our brief that the FCC acted in an arbitrary and capricious and therefore unlawful manner under the Administrative Procedure Act. It did not engage in any kind of reasoned decision-making, nor did it base its decision to terminate the notice of inquiry on any kind of substantial evidence. And substantial evidence is a legal term, meaning more than a scintilla, but less than a preponderance. So in other words, it's a very low bar to meet, but the FCC didn't even meet that bar. Further, we allege and argue that the FCC violated NEPA because it did not engage in an environmental review of the potential harm to the public and to the environment from its decision, from perpetuating these old regulations and not facing up to the fact that technology has changed. We argued that the decision, therefore, was a major federal action, which is kind of a key term, major federal action that requires NEPA review. And in this case, it was a major federal action, and the FCC should have engaged in an environmental assessment followed by an environmental impact statement, but it did not do either one of those things. Finally, there's a lot of evidence in the record from individuals, some of whom suffer from extraordinary sensitivity to radio frequency radiation. And there's a litany of problems that these people face in their lives, and they're very real. And we demonstrate in the brief that government agencies other than the FCC have recognized that this suffering is a disabling condition, can be an illness or injury, actually, that requires some redress by the federal government and other federal agencies. The FCC didn't even address that evidence, and therefore, again, violated the Administrative Procedure Act by ignoring the evidence, acting arbitrarily and capriciously. Also, the FCC cites the FDA website as proof that children in particular do not need special protection from radio frequency radiation, when in fact, there's a bunch of evidence in the record showing that children are particularly vulnerable. It's pretty much agreed, even by the FCC, that children receive more exposure from radio frequency radiation just based on their size, at the size of their head, actually, than adults. But there's additional evidence in the record showing that not only do children absorb more radiation, but they are more vulnerable to the effects of this radiation due to their developing brain. The Commission did not address any of that evidence. So we have filed now, as of July 29th, our opening brief. The Federal Communications Commission will have an opportunity to respond on behalf of the government. Its brief is due on September 14th. We'll then have an opportunity to file a reply brief, and that'll be due October 6th. Following that, we anticipate an order from the court establishing an oral argument date. Once that's established, and it occurs, we'll of course have to wait for the court's decision. It could be another year from now, I anticipate, before we get a court decision. That pretty much is an overview of what's going on in the court case. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ed. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Deborah Davis, President of Environmental Health Trust. Environmental Health Trust is a scientific think tank. We publish research, develop educational campaigns, and educate policymakers about preventable environmental health risks. Dr. Davis was founding director of the Board on Environmental Sciences and Toxicology of the U.S. National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences. Among the National Academy of Sciences reports she directed were those advising tobacco smoke be removed from airplanes and the environments of young children. She's authored over 200 publications in books and journals. Her book, When Smoke Ran Like Water, was designated a National Book Award finalist, and her recent book, Disconnect: The Truth About Cell Phone Radiation, What the Industry is Doing to Hide It and How to Protect Your Family, was selected by Time Magazine as a top pick in 2010. And a lot of that information is in the FCC docket. Dr. Davis, I wanted to ask if you had a few words about the appeal, and we'll be taking questions, which you can put into the chat.
First of all, I want to thank Ed Myers and Theodora Scarato for their work above and beyond the call. And I want to thank Children's Health Defense for their efforts as well, because this is very much a situation that requires all hands on deck. This lawsuit is the last thing between us and allowing radiation levels that we know can damage human health and the environment to become ubiquitous. And by that, I reference the fact that studies have mounted since 1996, showing that radiation from phones that does not cause any measurable change in temperature can in fact damage sperm. And as Mr. Myers just indicated, this radiation also gets more deeply into the skull and brain of children. I have been honored to work with laboratory researchers in Turkey and in other countries where we have modeled exposure into the brain, where we have shown that prenatally exposed animals, which of course we study because we're trying to predict effects in humans, prenatally exposed animals exposed to levels of radiation that do not change temperature can cause them to produce offspring with smaller brains and more damage to the part of the brain that we know is critical for thinking and memory and impulse control, namely the hippocampus. With colleagues in Brazil, Álvaro de Sales and Claudio Fernandez, we have produced a series of papers that have modeled the brain down to 1 millimeter squares. And we can show clearly that when this non-thermal radiation gets into the brain, it affects different parts of the brain, is absorbed more deeply. And I find it astonishing that in the 21st century, we are continuing to rely on 20th century thinking and methods for testing and evaluating these devices. It is an appalling reflection of the failure of this administration and others to take into account the most current science in order to provide protection for the now billions of children around the world that during the pandemic are spending more and more time with wireless devices, and their parents and teachers are not informed that the most basic protection needs to be undertaken to reduce exposure by seeing that distance is kept from these devices and the human body. I understand that there's a wide spectrum of what we mean of electromagnetic fields. It goes all the way from the things that turns on the lights in this hotel room from which I'm speaking to you right now, to the things that are involved in X-rays and cosmic radiation. There is no debate that non-ionizing radiation can have biological effects. They're different than ionizing radiation, X-rays and cosmic rays, but they're the same in some other ways, and they ultimately have the capacity to damage DNA, which is the basic building block that programs all living things, whether plants or animals. Now we know this because of work from the US National Toxicology Program and the Ramazzini Institute. And those studies from those institutions, which we reference in this very important brief that has just been filed today, those studies are the culmination of years of research. They're not one-off studies. They're not unique. They are simply confirming that non-thermal levels of radiation that can be produced by phones and other wireless devices today have the capacity to damage DNA, not because of their power, because of course the power of these devices is quite weak. The power of a phone is less than 1 watt on average. The power of a microwave oven may be 1,000 watts, but they're using the similar frequency, and it's the pulsed nature of that frequency, as we have explained in this brief, as others have explained in filings before the FCC, that clearly establish the capacity of this radiation to be harmful, which is why we are delighted now to be able to say that more and more people within this industry are reaching out to us to work with us to figure out how to make things safer, recognizing that the technology at this point is pervasive, but we have to have a better understanding of what we need to do. And one of the most important things we understand now is wherever possible, we should be using wired connections, because wired connections are faster, they're safer, and they're more secure from hacking. And a wired connection in your own home will reduce your exposure, and you'll end a lot of those fights about, could you please get off because I have to stream something from my professor or my teacher. Because if everyone is plugged in, you're going to get a much faster speed in addition to being safer from any hacking. So we are moving ahead on this. The lawsuit is against the FCC because the FCC is the relevant agency which has issued this determination. The FCC relies on the Food and Drug Administration. And just one final word. In 1999, experts at the Food and Drug Administration wrote to the US National Toxicology Program asking them to evaluate cell phone radiation in 1999. They did that because the US National Toxicology Program is and was recognized at that time as the flagship standard for testing chemicals and physical agents. Fast forward to 2019, and an extraordinary development occurs. The FDA, the agency that requested this study, is now rejecting the validity of animal research for humans. What makes this so preposterous and tragic is the fact that every agent that we know causes cancer in animals will also produce it every agent that we know can produce cancer in humans because we have definitive data from human harm. We'll also produce it in animals when adequately tested. And now you have a whole cottage industry trying to manufacture doubt and throw barbs at the National Toxicology Program because it's relying on animals, which is the fundamental basis for all pharmacology. For all of the vaccines that people are talking about, everything has to be tested first in animals because we test animals to predict effects in humans and prevent them from taking place. And now what we're doing is conducting a vast experiment on my children and grandchildren while we wait for more proof of human harm. We believe, and we have submitted in this brief, that we have ample proof of human harm, including the tragic phenomenon that some people are so sensitive to this radiation, they're unable to function in many environments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. What are the limits for pollinators, bees, insects, plants, and trees? Have there been limits that were developed by the Department of the Interior, the EPA, and what did their submissions state on the record, if they submitted at all?
So Deborah can answer the substance of this, but to my knowledge, there are no limits for bees, trees, plants, or animals. So
yes.
As to the need for the limits, maybe Deborah could address that a little bit.
Well, there are no limits that have been set for any of for plants or for trees. But what we do have are data from authorities in Europe that have actually created a three-dimensional, anatomically precise model of the honeybee. And this exquisitely developed model has been then tested with the frequencies that will be used in 5G. And it's important to understand that 5G is not only one frequency, but multiple frequencies, and that it will have to include some of 3G and a lot of 4G signal capacity within it, so that we're taking signals that are now often located distant away from people and potentially bringing them as close as your bedroom window, because in many areas, including the state of Wyoming, where I live, they are allowed to put a 5G antenna 8 feet above the ground, which in many cases is exactly where someone might be sleeping. And there are no limits as to the location of these devices. And what we know from the studies of honeybees is that these millimeter wave frequencies resonate exactly with the size of these small insects. Agriculture today depends on more than 2,000 pollinating insects, and those insects will not be able to work well if they are going to be exposed to this kind of 5G radiation. I have done a machine learning analysis with Malka Halgamug, who is a brilliant computer science expert in Melbourne, Australia. And we have shown that if you look at all of the studies that have ever been done that look at plant effects, there is strong evidence that this radiation can damage plant growth, can impair nitrification, can affect exquisite processes that are essential to the proliferation and healthy growth. And of course, ancient trees, as we know, the big, tall, charismatic redwoods, for example, function as antennas themselves. And there's been no consideration of this at all, despite the fact that the US Department of Fish and Wildlife in 2014 and repeatedly subsequently sent memos to the FCC saying, what about the birds and the trees? We're concerned about effects. And those data and all of that information can be found on our website at ehtrust.org. And some reference to the trees and studies on bees can be found in this important brief that we have just filed as well.
Yes. As a matter of fact, if you do look at the brief, you will see, as Deborah just indicated, a discussion of the impacts on animals and plant life. And there are some references to some of these studies. Some of them are a little older because the record in this case goes back to 2013. But there are studies indicating that, for example, this electromagnetic radiation has been associated with colony collapse disorder, what's called colony collapse disorder in bees, and also in other animals. It's had some effect on avian migratory birds, that is. There's a study from a former agency lead at the Fish and Wildlife Service about the impact on migratory birds. You'll see all that in the brief, but the studies that Deborah mentioned are more recent, and they're available on the EHT website, as she said.
Yes, and the guidelines that we have from 1996, which were based on science from even earlier than that, really only take into account the protecting against the burning or the overheating of tissue. And the limits are set thousands of times higher than exposure levels that are known to cause biological harm, and all of that is documented.
That's an important point, if I may elaborate. The point is that when these exposure guidelines were set in 1996, it was incorrectly believed that the only effect to be avoided was heating, and that if you did not heat tissue, then it would be okay. And in fact, all the tests that have ever been done on cell phones are predicated on avoiding heat. Now we know that that's a false premise, Now we know that there are effects that have nothing to do with heat. For example, if you take 2 test tubes of sperm from healthy men and you expose them to cell phone radiation in one test tube and nothing in the other, publications from the Cleveland Clinic and from Australia's counterpart to the Cleveland Clinic have repeatedly shown that the mitochondria, which is the engine of the sperm, get damaged by just a little bit of that radiation. And cross-sectional studies have found that men who keep the most wireless devices on their bodies, whether pagers or phones, etc., have the most reduced sperm count, the most damaged sperm, and the most difficulty in fertilizing a healthy pregnancy when and if they choose to do so.
So we have a lot of people on this call right now, so I apologize that we're not going to be able to answer everyone's questions. But I'm raising forward some of the questions right now. For clarification, question is the lawsuit filed against the FCC? Is it for them to update and test their pre-approved limits for 5G, delay the usage of 5G, or halt it altogether? And I just want to start off by saying that what this is about is the current limits that we have in place now for the set of frequencies that we have been using and a bit higher that the FCC set in 1996 is what this appeal is about. However, the FCC decided that their antiquated limits could remain the same, but now the FCC is using this decision on which to base their decision to take higher frequencies and in fact lower frequencies never used publicly for communications before to be a part of the 5G network. And they're saying that because of the decision that we are appealing, that they can go ahead and set limits which are based only on heating, that heating is the only harm and not taking into account the biological effects of which are well documented and which are all on the record, as well as people submitting that they've been harmed and requesting for environmental review and so forth. So I hope that answers that question. Someone wanted to know, do we have definitive studies on how electromagnetic radiation affects the blood-brain barrier, iron in the blood, and the
That's a very interesting story in and of itself. In 1970, a young researcher for the Office of Naval Research, Alan Frey, produced a study clearly showing that when you injected dye into the veins of animals, this is a labeled dye, that if you expose the animals to cell phone radiation, that dye ended up in their brain. He showed that in 1970. Independently, in 1992, Professor Leif Salford in Sweden showed the same thing. Now, interestingly, industry presented contrary evidence. Their evidence took animals and injected the dye in the stomach and then concluded 20, 30 minutes later, there was no dye in the brain after exposure to cell phone radiation. Well, your blood doesn't circulate as directly from your stomach as it does from your veins, quite obviously. And so this was an example of a study that was inconclusive by design. And unfortunately, as I've documented in my book, Disconnect, and as we document on our website at ehtrust.org, and as we documented in the hundreds of submissions that Environmental Health Trust scientists have made to the FCC over the past decade, we know that the blood-brain barrier is affected. And from the studies of the National Toxicology Program, we know that DNA of multiple organs can be damaged by exposure to levels of radiation that do not produce heat.
A question, are there any other countries in the world that have updated their exposure guidelines on radiation not based on heat that the FCC should research? And that was all submitted to the Federal Communications Commission, and we have that also on our website. Russia and China specifically, although there are many countries, actually several, that have exposure limits that are lower in terms of cell tower emissions than the United States. China and Russia both have documentation as to how they are based on the acknowledgement of effects that are lower, and that information is linked to on our site. As well as India, which actually did an interministerial report about a decade ago now, looking at birds, bees, and trees, and found that the majority of research showed effects, and they lowered their limits by 1/10 of what they were before.
Yeah, to 10 times lower than what they were before.
10 times lower.
Let me add something there. Given the sad state of global politics, I think anyone listening to this would understand that while the Russians and the Chinese may have more strict standards, they have no enforcement. So we have no way to know whether their standards, which are, as you say, much stricter, whether they are enforced. I know in the case of India, because I've traveled and talked to people there, that although they lowered their standards substantially, again, the health experts working in this field lowered the standards, recommended it as they should. But the telecom industry is not necessarily paying attention to it. And there's a constant battle going on between them within the same government, unfortunately. But you're absolutely right. When health experts look at the data, they make these very strong recommendations to reduce exposures based on the clear evidence that this can cause cancer in animals and humans, and that it can damage DNA, and that it can impair reproduction in males and females. And now we also, as you know, have studies on children. And perhaps you'd like to mention those, Ms. Scarrato. What do we know about children who are exposed for longer periods of time to their memory?
There was a replicated study, which is on the brief as well, that looked at teenagers, hundreds of teenagers, and this was a replication from a prior study. And they found that after 1 year of use with a cell phone to the head, and they did some modeling to understand where the highest levels of the radio frequency would be absorbed, they found damage to memory after 1 year. Now, again, the measurements that were done were based on heating only. And when you think about how the FCC has regulations related to how they test phones and how they measure the radiation, which are all irrelevant and really not applicable to how our biology is affected by electromagnetic radiation, specifically wireless.
One of the interesting points recently made by an engineer with whom we are working is the following. Your phone, your computer, your router are all tested so that they do not interfere with one another. That's what the FCC certifies. When you look at that little statement on it, it certifies they don't interfere with one another. But there's no test for their interfering with the human heart or the nervous system or the memory of children or the production of glucose in the brain. There are no tests required by the same agency to see whether or not there are impacts on human health as well as the environment. So at this point, I think we are grateful. I want to say to all of you who are on this call and to those who may hear it later, we could not have done this without the massive support we've seen from all of you. It means a great deal to each one of us at Environmental Health Trust to realize how many people out there share our concerns and have come to understand that this lawsuit must succeed. We have already won a victory thanks to Mr. Myers. We have already won a victory with respect to the requirement to look at the National Environmental Protection Act in other circumstances. But the issue before the court now is the following. Did this agency take a good, hard look? Did this agency provide a rational record of decision-making? Did this agency show that in any way it took seriously the thousands of pages of evidence submitted by hundreds of experts in the field? And we further add in our brief and on our website the fact that the US government today is relying on outdated science and relying on a group called the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. That is a minority group of scientists that is self-appointed, self-controlled, reports to no independent authority whatsoever, and has direct and deep ties to industry for many, many years. And the US government, instead of taking a hard look at the data, relied on a single statement from the FDA, which was anonymously written, that said, we don't think there's any problem. The American people deserve better than that right now. The FCC is charged with issuing standards that reflect the full consideration of the record. This record was opened in 2013. It suddenly closed out of the blue on December 4th of 2019 with no indication whatsoever of a rational foundation for their determination that today you could take 20th century safety standards and apply them to this 21st century technology that did not even exist when these standards were first articulated. So as you can imagine, and as Mr. Myers indicated, this lawsuit is going to go on for quite a while, and we need your support. We really do, to ensure that we can continue to make the case, because the American public is not being adequately protected. Not the trees, not the bees, not the rest of us. So we really need you to step up and continue to help us. For more information about this, you can look at our website, and we are really grateful to all the support that we have got. And so many of you have written to Theodora and me and said how grateful you are. But let me take this opportunity to say, we could not do this without you. It means the world to us to have this kind of support right now.
Thank you. And I have some more questions. Could Mr. Myers please explain the details of what the legal process is now that the brief has been filed? I understand he expects it will be a year. Is that for the court to respond, and has the FCC responded, if at all? Maybe you can go over that timeline again.
Sure. So our brief was due on behalf of Environmental Health Trust and the other petitioners yesterday, July 29th. The FCC's brief responding to ours is due September 14. Then we will get a chance to reply to the FCC by filing a reply brief on October 6. Sometime after that, we will have oral argument. That date has not been fixed yet. The court will issue an order establishing an oral argument date. From the time of oral argument to the time that the court issues its decision, I expect probably 9 months, maybe a year. It depends on the court's other workload. Once the court issues its decision, presuming we're happy with the result, the matter will be sent back to the Federal Communications Commission to reopen the notice of inquiry proceeding. That will force it to actually engage in an analysis of the evidence. Probably it will solicit new evidence. That would be my expectation, because the evidence in the record is quite old at this point. So the commission will have to decide at that time whether to propose a new rule with new safety standards. That will create a new rulemaking proceeding and ultimately a new regulation. Hopefully it'll be a more satisfactory regulation than they have now.
Thank you. There are a few questions more. One is about the 50-fold safety factor, or should I say the myth of the 50-fold safety factor, because in the brief it's talked about in the inquiry in 2013, the FCC talked about a 50-fold safety factor in regard to these regulations. And several submissions addressed this at several levels. One, that effects have been found at levels 1,000 times below as well, that it doesn't even apply, that the 50-fold safety factor really doesn't apply to cell phone testing or those handheld wireless devices, because it's not just about phones anymore. All those devices that we're presented with that have the fine print warning and that people are holding close to their bodies. And then the third thing is that in the overwarning, that the FCC says that they don't need to make clearer, there doesn't need to be any clarification to consumers about devices being close to the body, and that would be overwarning the public. And I wanted your thoughts on that. I'm trying to consolidate some of these questions.
And as you both know, the test system that we have does not reflect reality. The Chicago Tribune confirmed when you tested phones in the pocket, they emitted under their system up to 5 times more radiation, looking at the most common phones used at the time. The French government has similarly shown this, and when you extrapolate the government's work to US standards, Om Gandhi and we have shown, and this is on our website, that phones can emit up to 11 times more radiation than the current FCC standards allow. Now, keep in mind, those standards, again, were set solely to avoid heat, and we know that that's not adequate. So we have ample evidence that the current standards are inadequate and need to be changed, and it is hard to imagine what thinking might have gone on in the FCC for them to say that there's no need to change the standards that are 24 years old. I think we have had a clue when in 2016, FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler said, we don't need to wait for standards. We're just going to go ahead. We're not going to get hung up with standards and things like that. He said that in 2016. And I will remind you that this is not an issue where Democrats or Republicans have distinguished themselves by a concern for public health. All of them have been convinced until very recently that there's a problem. But now actually Senator Jim Inhofe is holding up the appointment of an FCC commissioner because he is insisting for more proof and evidence with respect to 5G. And if others will join him, I think it will be a very interesting development, because we have failed so far to get the attention of those who are in positions of authority. And frankly, as the Harvard University report documented some time ago, the FCC has been a captured agency. The commissioners, the chairman, they come and go from the cell phone and the telecom industry. And it's seen as a perfectly normal thing. Well, we at Environmental Health Trust and our colleagues at Children's Health Defense do not accept that. We do not think that business as usual should be allowed to continue under these circumstances. And the brief that we've submitted here together and all the work that we have done is dedicated to establishing the need for serious standards, for a hard look at the science, to review and revise the standards to reflect the latest science that there has been abundant evidence of. Let me just add one thing. France has an entire agency that is devoted to evaluating frequencies of microwave radiation from devices. An entire agency. We have nothing. We have no studies. We have no funding. We have no monitoring. We have no surveillance. And we at Environmental Health Trust are going to work as long and hard as we can until we have a system where cell phones are treated just like pharmaceuticals, where they're monitored, where they're studied, where they are improved. We know that we can create safer and better technologies, and we know that children should not be exposed to this in schools and that systems need to be changed. But while we're dealing with the pandemic, please, those of you parents who are struggling with your children at home, please look at our website for valuable information about how you can wire your home now. It's not that hard. It's really quite simple. You'll protect your children. You'll actually protect your mental health as well. And you'll be able to see that together we will create a healthier and safer environment by following this kind of information.
Thank you. There were a lot of questions on schools, and we have also a web page dedicated to schools, resources for parents and teachers as well. There are a few technical questions or procedural questions. Is it possible that the commission could change following the election if Biden won, and that the new commission would reopen the question or case in a different way?
Yes. The short answer is yes, it's quite possible that things could change. Congress could change as well, and there might be hope of persuading Congress to do something.
But that hope will only come if people listening to this call each get 10 people to pay attention to this issue, because Congress at this point will follow the public. They're not going to lead. I gather that, again, Senator Inhofe has become persuaded of this issue. I know that there are other senators that are concerned about this, like Senator Kennedy in Louisiana. And I know that Senator Markey has had a long-standing expression of interest in this issue as well, having asked the GAO to do reports on this. And the GAO did do a report, that's the Government Accountability Office, which advised the FCC to look again at their standards, particularly with respect to their failure to provide any protection whatsoever for young children or pregnant women. And basically, the FCC has said, we're going to forget what the GAO has said. We're going to ignore what the American Academy of Pediatrics has said. We're going to ignore what the dozens of scientists from Environmental Health Trust have said. We're going to ignore what the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences National Toxicology Program has found. And we're going to ignore the dozens of submissions from many of you who are on this call. So that is what people have got to make clear to their elected officials. That cannot be allowed to continue.
There were over 30 and more than that medical organizations, groups of scientists who were calling for appeals to reduce exposure to wireless radiation and to set biologically based standards. And the American Academy of Pediatrics, which shockingly the FCC didn't even acknowledge, talked about how the SAR, that's a test that is based on heating for cell phones and compliance testing, was not an exposure metrics that really had utility in protecting the health of pregnant women and children, and not answered at all by the FCC. So.
I might add, all these documents that Theodore is referring to from the proceeding are available on the FCC website. If you do a little digging, you'll find them there. And many of them are linked to our brief. Most of our footnotes to the record have live links that will take you immediately to the documents we discuss.
Another question, I'm merging two, seem to be together, has the Consumer Product Safety Commission gotten involved on cell phone radiation? And what about the FDA, and can they be sued as well?
So, to my knowledge, the Consumer Product Safety Commission has not been engaged in this, and the FDA, maybe Deborah knows more about that, but the FDA and the FCC have overlapping jurisdiction over cell phones. The FDA does review cell phones supposedly for safety, but it's been largely ineffective. Deborah, you might want to jump in here because it's a little out of my bailiwick.
Well, there's something called the Interagency Work Group on non-ionizing radiation. And I would be willing to bet you it has not officially met in quite some time. And we saw in the record, as you were putting together the brief, Ed, we saw evidence that there was this last-minute attempt to ask other agencies their opinions, but there was never any systematic effort to inquire with the sister expert agencies like FDA, like NTP, and like OSHA, like NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. None of them was asked for their professional expert opinion on the science. The agency never made any attempt to do a searching, systematic, hard look at the evidence submitted for the record, nor did they seek out an independent evaluation from their sister agencies. Instead, they relied on outdated studies and outdated findings. We talked, if I may, for a moment about the safety factor. I think it might be useful. The original studies that were done in the 1970s and 80s by Om Gandhi and others took rats that had been starved and trained to run a maze for a food reward. Okay, that's what it was. They took the animals, they were hungry, and they had them run through a maze to get food. They put a rectal probe in them to measure their body temperature. And then they measured the temperature at which their body had to reach in order to stop trying to get food when they were starving. So there's no 50-fold safety factor. It's an illusion. It always has been. And the fact that here we are in 2020 talking about 1996 standards that were based on 1986 science, it boggles the mind. It boggles the mind. And I think we all need to take a step back. Yes, the technology is miraculous. It has radically improved our ability to respond to emergencies. There's no question about it. At the same time, it has created a sense in our society that everything's an emergency. You always have to respond the moment the phone dings or the light comes in. And this has been designed, we know this from people in the industry, to create a very much a dependency, even an addiction on the technology. So it is toxic technology. We need to switch to safe, wired approaches. And we need to understand that what we have done with it was premised on the naive and incorrect assumption that this was completely harmless. We now know that is not correct. So look, don't worry if you've been doing this all along. Just get your phone off your body. Don't use it unless the signal is strong. Use a headset, use a speakerphone, and don't use your phone when you can use a landline, when you can use a plugged-in computer to compute, to talk to people. It's not necessary to find yourself tethered to this device. And that's going to take a lot of public education for us all to understand this and for us to reclaim what's most important in our lives and recognize that sometimes what has been life-saving in some circumstances has also been damaging in others.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We have a few more minutes, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of these questions, but I'll be following up with an email that will include links to the docket, to our brief, and to resources and several of the dozens of questions which have been asked here. Any final words, Mr. Myers?
Well, I appreciate everyone who has attended, listening to what we have to say. I would have to say I was totally ignorant of this issue until a few years ago when I realized that there was a company planning to put a small cell 5G tower directly across the street from my home. And that's when I began to learn about the issue. And having nearly 40 years of experience working with the federal government, sometimes in the federal government, I was shocked to find the complete disregard for facts in the FCC's treatment of this issue. And that's what spurred me to get involved. And I urge all of you to take a hard look at this issue, and to the extent you're able, to participate in opposing what the FCC has been trying not to do, and to get it to do its job properly.
And I would
Thank you
add,
very much.
may I add that one of the things that's become available to us now is that if those of you who have 401ks or have appreciated stocks can make donations to this lawsuit through our account by writing to info@ehtrust.org. And every little bit makes a big difference for us now. I would add that the interagency working group I referred to basically got co-opted, according to Libby Kelly, who's been the executive secretary of the International Commission on Electromagnetic Safety, and is now organizing a very important medical conference, which will take place in January, to work with physicians to improve their understanding of the serious problems that people face from exposure, including those who face radiation sickness, which can be absolutely incapacitating and devastating. And again, we have many, many people who worked in the industry or worked in the military who are now coming to us for help because they recognize this is a problem. We are very grateful to all of you, and I want to say a special word of thanks to Theodora Scarato, who is holding us all together in thick and thin, and we're looking forward to working with you in the months to come. As we advance further, our brief will be on our website, as will all the relevant information, and we can please continue to share it and make sure people understand that they have a right to know how to be safer today, and work with us and others who are seeking to make this happen. Thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this hearing. We've heard from a lot of witnesses from you today and others previously about the very important potential of 5G technology. It promises to bring us a new era of connectivity with internet speeds as much as 5 times faster than what we have today, with much lower latency, and that's all a good thing. But 5G, as you well know, also uses higher frequency waves that don't travel as far and will rely on a network of hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of small cell sites. And the question then is, are there any health implications, any public safety implications to those additional sites that are likely to be located close to homes, schools, workplaces, and closer to the ground? Correct?
Correct, Senator. Yes.
So in December of 2018, I sent a letter to FCC Commissioner Carr asking him to cite for me recent scientific studies demonstrating the safety of this technology. What research has been done, where has it been published and compiled? He has essentially failed to do so, and just echoed the general statements of the FDA, which shares regulatory responsibility for cell phones with the FCC. If you go to the FDA website, pretty unsatisfactory. There basically is a cursory and superficial citation to existing scientific data saying, quote, "The FDA has urged the cell phone industry to take a number of steps, including support additional research on possible biological effects of radio frequency fields for the type of signal emitted by cell phones." I believe that Americans deserve to know what the health effects are, not to prejudge what scientific studies may show, and they deserve also a commitment to do the research on outstanding questions. So my question for you, particularly Mr. Gillen and Mr. Perry, how much money has the industry committed to supporting additional independent research? I stress independent research. Is that independent research ongoing? Has any been completed? Where can consumers look for it? And we're talking about research on the biological effects of this new technology.
Thank you, Senator. I think, thank you for your focus on the issue. Safety is paramount, and as you alluded to, we rely on the expert agencies, we rely on the findings of the FDA and others as to the requirements to keep all of us safe. There are no industry-backed studies, to my knowledge right now. Happy to visit with you as to what opportunities you think there needs to be more studies, and we're always for more science. We also rely on what the scientists tell us.
So essentially, the answer to my question, how much money? Zero.
I can certainly follow up with you, Senator. To my knowledge, there's no active studies being backed by industry today.
Anybody else know of industry commitments to back research, fund it, support it, to ascertain scientifically the health effect?
Senator, I'm not aware either, but I do know that with small cells especially, you're going to have lower power levels. And of course, as from a carrier perspective, you want to be able to manage interference so that that interference is the lowest interference possible. So I would think that some of those studies or some of that information could be utilized in looking at the health consequences. But no, I'm not aware of any.
So there really is no research ongoing. We're kind of flying blind here, so far as health and safety is concerned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Probably the most important thing I did, I was involved as a young scientist in the committee that actually reviewed the data and recommended that there be no smoking on airplanes. You may be shocked to hear that it was even a question for science at the time, but it was. And when I look at what we know now about mobile phone radiation, I see some very interesting similarities.
A growing number of prominent doctors and scientists are raising warning flags over radiation this morning, and your kids could be facing a greater risk of exposure.
I think the most important study is a study by the National Toxicology Program in a classic large carcinogenicity test, one of the largest ever performed, and for that matter, one of the most expensive. They found increased risk of the tumors, which we believe radiofrequency radiation is causing in man. Particular tumors called schwannomas. In the rats, they were in the heart. In humans, they're often in the nerve, the ear nerve, the vestibular nerve.
Cell phone providers say they follow all safety guidelines put into place by the FCC. The current FCC safety standard was developed nearly 20 years ago.
The manufacturers actually tell people in the instruction manual, which I've never read, not to put the cell phone against your ear.
It does say exactly that. There's the BlackBerry, for example, warns to keep your phone at least 0.98 inches away from the body when transmitting. With an iPhone, for example, it's 5/8 of an inch.
At this point, the evidence has become sufficiently strong that cell phone radiation is a human carcinogen.
A major development from California's Department of Public Health. High use of cell phones may be linked to certain types of cancer and other health effects, including brain cancer and tumors, lower sperm counts, headaches, and effects on learning, memory, hearing, behavior, and sleep.
If it was a real problem, I would know. If it was a real problem, the government would protect us. How come I'm not hearing about this? They're all things I've heard when I give seminars. You know, I get up there and they say, oh yeah, if this was really a problem, they would have told us. I am they. I am a, legitimate scientist, and I am telling you.